Welcome to Ask the Hard Questions, Season 1, Episode 19, Ministry of Death, Cursed Goodness. They did not just question a doctrine, they put Yahweh on trial. They took what the Holy One called holy, righteous, and good and rebranded it as death, curse, bondage, and burden. Then they kept his name on the sign, kept his promises in their mouth, kept his blessings in their sermons, and demanded you clap while they spit on the fingerprints of the king. That is the scam. Borrow the crown, reject the terms. Keep the benefits, bury the covenant. Sing about mercy, then outlaw obedience. Call it grace, but use it as immunity. And watch how the system behaves when you bring the poor into the room. Watch how quickly love becomes policy. Watch how fast freedom becomes selective enforcement. They preach not under the law, then reach for commandments like weapons, only against the people they already hate. That is not discipleship. That is a rigged scale with a cross sticker on it. So this episode is not a devotional. It is an indictment. We are dragging their favorite phrase, ministry of death, into daylight and forcing it to answer one question it has dodged for generations. If Yahweh's law is a curse, then what does that make Yahweh? No fog, no soft landings, no protected class, no for us exceptions. Tonight we put the later voices on the stand. We let the public words of the Messiah speak, and we watch the loophole gospel choke in open air. Because truth survives equal weights. Lies require rigged scales. Ask the hard questions. So let us begin. New Year's isn't a mood, it's a reckoning. And the first thing that has to die is the lazy two-covenant fairy tale that lets people keep the crown words while tossing the king's terms into the trash. We walked the whole record. Covenant did not start as a slogan, and it does not end as one. Heaven does not run on product launches. The Holy One forged one covenant relationship in real history, anchored it at Sinai, enforced it with real consequences, and renewed it when people shattered it. Withdrawn for discipline is not replaced. Renewed is not deleted. The same God who defines justice does not wake up one day and call his own justice a curse so wolves can breathe easier. That's the core. One covenant, one standard, one definition of love with teeth, because it protects the crushed and restrains the greedy. One God whose character does not mutate because empire needs a loophole. Here's the modern problem. They want covenant benefits without covenant fidelity. They want forgiveness as a blank check, not forgiveness as restoration back into loyalty. They want fulfilled to mean no more accountability because accountability is expensive. It costs comfort. It costs social belonging. It costs the seat on Sunday. So they split what God kept whole. They label everything that exposes them as old and everything that protects their indulgence as new. But you cannot cut a covenant in half and still call it covenant. You cannot amputate the commands and keep the promises. You cannot reject the terms and demand the inheritance. You do not get to spit on the root and then sell the fruit. So we pivot into 2026 with a deliberate test. Stop relitigating what we already proved and take their favorite claim at face value, not to debate, but to apply. We're not under a covenant anymore. Jesus fulfilled it, so it's done. There's no covenant now, so there's no law from God for us. Fine. Then walk that claim all the way to the logical end without cheating. If there is no covenant, there is no covenant faithfulness. If there is no covenant faithfulness, then sin is not treason, it is personal preference. If sin is preference, then judgment is theater. If judgment is theater, then their outrage is fake and selective, condemning what they dislike, excusing what serves their tribe. And if that is the case, their religion is not discipleship. It is branding. It is a stage. It is a club built on a loophole. Watch the mask slip when you demand consistency. They shout not under the law, while still quoting moral rules whenever it benefits them. They say the covenant is dead while still demanding God's protection, God's favor, God's hearing, God's blessing, God's heaven, and God's covering. They preach freedom while enforcing man-made boundaries with more fury than they ever had for mercy and justice. That is not faith. That is a system that survives on exemptions. So 2026 is not a fresh year. It is a stress test. Equal application, no protected class, no soft landings, no for us grace and for them condemnation. If the covenant is dead, then it is dead for everybody. No selective outrage, no moral posturing, no weaponized virtue. No pretending God still backs your preferences while you deny his terms. And if the covenant is one and continuous, if God is consistent, then fulfilled cannot mean lawless. It means the debt is paid and the rebellion is confronted, not endorsed. Relationship restored, not erased. The king finished redemption, not the work of making sin untouchable. So let the year expose it. Let consistency do what it always does. Truth survives equal weights. Lies require rigged scales. Next, we press the blade deeper, because the loophole gospel only breathes in fog, and daylight makes it choke. Covenant is not religious decoration. Covenant is jurisdiction. It defines what counts as loyalty, what counts as treason, what counts as justice, and what counts as mercy. If you do not know what covenant you are in, you will live under somebody else's law while calling it freedom. And that is what no covenant produces every time. Not neutrality, not purity, not some floating spiritual cloud, just a trade. God's terms get dumped, and man's terms move in. The covenant that restrains the strong and protects the weak gets mocked as bondage, and the covenant of comfort, cash flow, and tribal power gets renamed grace. Permission dressed in sacred language. Immunity painted as liberty. That is the switch. So when they chant fulfilled like an eraser, remember this. Erasers do not redeem. They only hide. Redemption confronts rebellion and restores relationship. In the next stretch, we force the slogans into daylight and make them live like real claims until the doctrine stands or breaks. No more fog. No more for us exceptions. Either the king is consistent or the system is a lie. 2026 will not be kind to loopholes. It will drag every doctrine to its logical end. Open air, full sun. No hiding place, no deal. No more editing God to save a system. Choose obedience or choose the teeth. Here, you want proof? Watch what happens when we quote him. Quote him, and the wolves bleed. Do not think that I came to destroy the Torah. I did not come to destroy, but to fill to fullness and bring to full measure. Matthew 5:17. Whoever loosens even the least commandment will be called least in the kingdom. Matthew 5:19. Not everyone who says to me, Master, will enter, but the one doing the will of my Father. Matthew 7:21. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Matthew 7:23. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. John 14:15. That is not vague. That is not symbolic. That is not optional. That is the kingdom constitution spoken by the king himself. So why does the system panic when the word keep enters the room? Because keep destroys their business model. Their model needs a Messiah who never says obey, never says endure, never says do, never says commandments, never says narrow path. They need a mascot, not a master. Revelation does not treat this like a hobby. It treats it like war and verdict. Here is the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and the faithfulness of Jesus. Revelation 14:12. They keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. Revelation 12:17. And the Torah and the prophets do not apologize for being the voice of the Holy One. The Torah of Yahweh is complete, restoring the soul. Psalm 19:7. These words are your life. Deuteronomy 32:47. I will put my Torah within them and write it on their heart. Jeremiah 31:33. I will cause you to walk in my statutes. Ezekiel 36:27. So what is the claim again? That the Holy One wrote a curse, called it life, called it justice, promised to write it on hearts, and then later decided it was evil? That is not good news. That is character assassination. And the Jerusalem witnesses do not offer a faith-only escape hatch. They drag fake faith into the street and expose it as dead. What profit if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? James 2:14. Faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. James 2:17. Certain men pervert grace into lawlessness. Jude 1:4. He who says, I know him, and does not keep his commandments is a liar. 1 John 2:4. Real grace does not erase obedience. Real grace produces obedience. Real grace does not protect wolves. It exposes them. Real grace does not cancel justice. It restores rebels back into loyalty to the king. And when people choose the loophole, they do not become free. They become owned. They trade Yahweh's covenant terms for man's terms, then slap heaven's label on it. They call it liberty while it functions like immunity. They call it love while it functions like lawlessness. They call it spirit while it contradicts the public words of the Messiah. Now hear the warning the system refuses to put on the screen. If we go on sinning willfully, there no longer remains a sacrifice. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Hebrews 10:26-31. Blessed are those who do his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life. Revelation 22:14. Obedience is the separator. That is why they want a stake that cancels the king's commands. That is why they want a spirit that agrees with flesh. That is why they want a gospel that never forces a decision. But this cast is a decision. Watching and listening is not a spectator sport. You are either with the king's words, or you are with the system that edits them. So stop protecting contradictions. Stop baptizing lawlessness. Stop pretending the covenant is dead while demanding covenant benefits. Stop cursing what Yahweh called life. Stop calling rebellion covered and calling outsiders evil with the same mouth. Return to the commandments. Return to justice. Return to Sabbath holiness. Come out of Babylon's mouth and into the king's words. And do not pretend worship can cover lawlessness. The prophets stripped that mask. I reject your feasts. Take away from me the noise of your songs. Let justice roll down like waters. Amos 5:21-24. Bring no more worthless offerings. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Correct oppression. Isaiah 1:13-17. Why do you call me Master, Master, and do not do what I say? Luke 6:46. Sunday sound systems cannot bleach Monday cruelty. A stage cannot rename sin. A sermon cannot overwrite a torn-down stranger, a crushed widow, a bought judge, a silenced truth-teller. When the system blesses what harms the poor and calls it favor, it is not blessing, it is evidence. And Revelation does not whisper about Babylon, it commands separation. Come out of her, my people, so you do not share in her sins. Revelation 18:4. They do not become neutral when they bury covenant. They become owned. Because when you throw away the king's terms, you do not escape law, you just change masters. You stop living under a law that restrains the strong and protects the weak, and you kneel to the law of comfort, donors, algorithms, party loyalty, and keep the seat on Sunday. That is why the two-covenant myth is useful to the machine. It lets them say, God's covenant terms are old, while still screaming moral rules when it serves them. It lets them keep the language of holiness without the cost of holiness. It lets them condemn outsiders with borrowed fragments, while excusing insiders with not under the law. Selective enforcement dressed as salvation. But one covenant reality destroys selective enforcement. One covenant means one measure. Same standard for pulpit and street, rich and poor, citizen and stranger, tribe you love and tribe you fear. One covenant means you do not get a private morality where your sins get renamed covered and other people's sins get called evil. One covenant means God does not turn into a liar just so your system can keep its platform. So hear the fork in the road. There are only two honest positions. Either the covenant stands in continuity, renewed, internalized, brought to completion, but still the same king, the same justice, the same definition of love, and you submit to God as God. Or you declare the covenant dead. No terms, no obligation, no binding authority. And then you must stop pretending you have any right to God's promises, God's protection, or God's moral voice. You cannot bury the covenant and keep its benefits like a corpse you rob for jewelry. This is why 2026 exposes everything. If they truly believe no covenant, then they must stop preaching sin, stop preaching repentance, stop preaching judgment, stop preaching obedience, and stop preaching God's will, because all of that requires covenant. Without covenant, God's will becomes a motivational quote. Holiness becomes personal taste. The whole religion collapses into therapy with religious wallpaper. But they will not do that. They cannot. Their system depends on having law when they want it, and no law when it hurts. They need commandments to police the poor, the outsider, the disliked, the inconvenient. And they need not under the law to protect the polished wolves, the platform men, the donors, and the empire-friendly religion that blesses what God judges. So we demand consistency until the doctrine either stands or breaks, because truth survives equal weights. Lies require rigged scales. The later voices pulled a knife on God's own hand. They tell you God's law is a curse, a ministry of death, something you must be freed from. Then they try to keep God holy while they curse what his finger wrote. That is blasphemy. Here is their trick. They separate God from his will. They separate the Father from what the Father commanded. They separate the King from the constitution of his kingdom. Then they sell you a new God, a God whose grace is permission, whose love is lawlessness, whose spirit contradicts the words spoken in public. Listen, if his law is a curse, then his will is a curse. If his finger writes a curse, then he is the curse. If his commandments are death, then the Holy One is death. You cannot keep the name good on your lips while you spit on what he commanded. And look at the record they wrote against themselves. They wrote, "The letter kills," and "the ministry of death," 2 Corinthians 3, 6-7. They wrote, "You are not under law," Romans 6:14. They wrote, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law," Galatians 3:13. They wrote, "He abolished the law of commandments," Ephesians 2:15. They wrote, "The handwriting was taken out of the way," Colossians 2:14. Now turn their own blade back. If the letter kills, then the God who spoke it kills. If the ministry of death came from God, then God is a minister of death. If the law is curse, then God cursed himself when he wrote it. And if God's covenant is a curse, then you are preaching a cursed God and calling it good news. And the contradiction is already inside their own pages. So the law is holy, and the commandment holy and righteous and good. Romans 7:12. Do we nullify the law through faith? May it never be. Rather, we establish the law. Romans 3:31. Keeping the commandments of God matters. 1 Corinthians 7:19. So which is it? Curse or holy? Death or good? The later voice system collapses in daylight. In the next stretch, we stop arguing with slogans and let the king speak. When his words hit the room, the wolves start sweating, because their freedom has always depended on silencing keep. The question is not complicated. Who has authority? Public words of the Messiah, or later voices that insult the Father's own handwriting? So choose your loyalty. Not in feelings, not in slogans, not in loopholes. Choose obedience that costs comfort, and costs your seat, and costs your reputation with wolves. Choose the narrow path, and let the wide road keep its crowd. No more deals. Now ask the hard questions. And I thank you for joining me today. If this episode made you angry, good. That means the fog is lifting. Anger is what happens when a lie gets cornered and your conscience finally gets oxygen. Now do not waste that fire on comments and scrolling. Use it to leave the loophole behind. Stop protecting a system that curses what Yahweh called good. Stop singing about holiness while defending lawlessness. Stop calling him master while ignoring what he says. Pick a side and walk it. Obedience is not a vibe. Obedience is proof. If you are still sitting in a Sunday machine that needs confusion to survive, hear this. You do not reform Babylon. You come out. You do not negotiate with wolves. You stop feeding them. You do not ask for permission to obey the king. You just obey. Share this cast. Put it on the screen where the excuses live. Send it to the person who keeps saying, "But that was old." Make them answer one question in daylight. Who has authority? The public words of the Messiah, or later voices that curse the Father's own handwriting? Find me, Eric Osborne at Eric Seeks Truth on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and the Ask the Hard Questions podcast. I love you all and wish you the very best with your free will decisions. Ask the hard questions. #Eric Seeks Truth.